Greetings from a gloomy Chicago. My name is Rachel Piontek, and I'm the Executive Director of the Stigler Center. Thank you all for joining us for a timely conversation with Professors Fiona Scott Morton and Filippo Lancieri on Fiona's new book, Digital Platform Regulation: Making Markets Work for People. The book is available online free of charge. I also encourage you to look at the Stigler Committee on Digital Platforms report that we published in 2019, from which Fiona was one of the subcommittee chairs and Filippo was one of the organizers. The relevant links can be found in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. The event today is part of the Stigler Center Speaker Series. Please check our website for future programs, as well as our publication, promarket.org, which Filippo and Fiona are frequent contributors, and subscribe to our Capitalism podcast. Before we begin today, please note that we are on the record and we will post this to our YouTube channel later. If you have any questions for the speakers, please submit those via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will have time for answers towards the middle end of the conversation. As usual, the views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And while the full bios for our speakers can be found on our event page, please let me briefly introduce them. Fiona Scott Morton is the Theodore Nurnberg Professor of Economics at Yale University School of Management, where she also founded and directs the Thurman Arnold Project. Her current research focuses on the economics of antitrust, as well as competition in healthcare markets. Among other key positions, she has served as chief economist at the DOJ Antitrust Division. Filippo Lancieri is an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, and he is a Stigler Center Fellow. His research focuses on understanding how governments shape markets and, in turn, how markets shape governments. Thank you both for being here, and now I will turn it over to Filippo. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us from a very sunny Washington, D.C., the opposite here. It's really a pleasure to be moderating this conversation with Fiona. I feel that I can think of very few people who have been engaged in this conversation about digital markets, digital competition, digital regulation for such a long time, right? In a way, Fiona was the chair, of course, of the subcommittee on antitrust, of the Stigler report. But beyond that, she has been always in this cross-platform conversation between Europe, the US, Brazil, other countries. And so for us, I think for me also in particular, it's really a pleasure to host Fiona and to have this chat about where we are in terms of these changes that we're implementing the competition policy all over the world, I think. So before we start, Fiona is going to start her presentation. We have our disclosure policy for the Stigler Center. So I'll start with my disclosure. So in 2023, I received a grant from SEHE, which is a Brussels think tank to engage in research about the implementation of access to data and algorithms under the DMA and the DSA, which are two regulations that we'll discuss today. And that report was jointly supported by the British Ofcom, the French Arcom, Google, Booking.com, and TikTok. And without further ado, now I pass to Fiona. I'll let her introduce herself, start the presentation, the disclosures, and we'll take it from there. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Filippo, and thank you to the Stigler Center for hosting this excellent series, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. Let me do my disclosures. I have consulting projects for Microsoft for classes of consumers against both Meta and Google in the UK, and I have other clients in the US in automotive, chemicals, and healthcare that are not related to digital platforms. And I regularly work for governments on antitrust matters that are confidential.
Awesome. I'll give it to you. So you present by some 10, 15 minutes.
I present by myself. Okay, great. Let me share a couple of slides in that case. Here they are. This is the book. The cover of it is represented here, and what you see is a table of contents on the right-hand side. This book is actually available for free. It's PDF on my website. You can see the URL at the bottom of the page. So anybody who would like to have a copy of this book or peruse it is welcome to go there and download the book. Let me just tell you a little bit about the 6 parts that are here on the page in front of you. So the first is trying to explain to economists and generally people who might not be Europeans, as well as those who are, what the DMA actually is. And I think the easiest way to describe it is its regulation of an existing interface that a digital platform has already established, like an app store. And what it does with that existing interface is give legal certainty to the other side, the business users, that they can keep accessing that platform with the same functionality as the platform's own businesses, let's say music. So you've got Apple Music and Spotify, for example, and without self-preferencing on the part of the platform to advantage their business over anybody else's business. This should be pro-innovation in the sense that it helps the business user know that they have a secure place to sell their stuff. They can't be kicked off if they do something clever and innovative, and gives them, therefore, both the ability and the incentive to do more innovation. The goals of the DMA are contestability and fairness. What do those mean? Contestability is this idea that entry barriers are lower, and we'll go through some of the things that the DMA does to show you how those entry barriers have fallen. And again, then the idea is we're going to have more competition on the platform and possibly between platforms. The fairness idea for economists comes down to business users and end users receiving their share of the surplus that's commensurate with their investment in innovation. So if I have some great innovation, I launch my app on the platform, because of its market power, can take all the surplus. And it might have been my great idea, but I don't get anything because the platform has all the power. So the idea of the fairness here is that users, and both business and end users, get the contribution they would get in a more competitive environment. So let me tell you a little bit about Chapter 2, Apple's App Store. You may know that Apple's App Store is the sole distribution channel for apps on Apple's iPhone and iPad in the United States. In the EU, the requirement in the DMA is that both Apple and Google open up to rival app stores, and by the way, rival digital wallets and accessories and hardware that go with the phones. So let's think about what competition in app stores and openness in app stores might look like. Let's first separate the review of the app, which is going to be done by the OS and is currently done by the OS. So they review the app to make sure it works and it's safe. That's one functionality that we're going to leave with the platform, and we can regulate it so we can say it has to be done fairly and non-discriminatorily and at cost. And then we're going to separately say, well, the developer, the owner of that app, can choose how they wish to distribute it. They could distribute it through Apple's App Store or through a rival app store, for example, or on the web as a reader app that the reader downloads. So once you get to a place where the app can decide how it wants to be distributed, then app stores should compete for the business of apps. Now, how much are they going to charge the apps for distribution? What kind of services and quality will they deliver? What kind of group of consumers can they deliver? Will there be areas where you've got an interest group of consumers that are all very interested in a particular app, and maybe that app can advertise and deliver those consumers? So one example I think of is an app store that would be run perhaps as a nonprofit, like Consumer Reports, that attracts businesses that have a low carbon footprint. And if you have a sufficiently good carbon footprint, you can get into that app, and somebody like me could download the Green App Store. And in there would be businesses, the better scooter, the scooter with the green power, the bank with the better carbon footprint, the restaurant delivery with the better carbon footprint, things like that. You could imagine an app store that was a cooperative of newspapers. Newspapers don't want to sell their subscriptions today on Apple and Google because they take 30% or 15%. What about having a co-op, a joint venture of a bunch of newspapers? They would just pay cost for their distribution. They might be able to get users to share personal data because the users want to support the news by allowing targeted ads to be targeted to them. Maybe we could leave a method of payment in this store and pay for individual articles as well as subscriptions. A children's app store is a pretty obvious one. So the idea that I'm trying to get you to think through is that Apple and Google have made us focus on the commission rate as being the issue for app stores, and really the things that are sold in app stores are gaming. And that to me is just a very small piece of the pie. The bigger pie is the innovation pie, where we could have app stores that actually do different things. And that would be pretty fun and exciting, and it would make the handset even more valuable and everybody happier, and unleash a possible wave of innovation in the jurisdiction that allows this to happen. A second thing that's really important about the App Store example is that an App Store can become middleware. So if you think about WeChat in China, or in general, any store where I log into my store and it's got a bunch of things that I do there. If that store writes for the new operating system that enters, it's very easy for me to switch to the new operating system. I just download the store, log in, and away I go, just like I did before. So middleware, as we know from the Microsoft antitrust case, is very powerful at reducing switching costs and causing, therefore, the entry of rival operating systems. And that would be a really great thing, to have a few more operating systems other than the two we've got. So that's one place the DMA makes a rule. Another place is personal social networks, Facebook and Instagram. Actually, I'm going to skip that because the answer to I'll come back to it at the end. The book gives you an answer to personal social networks that's not actually in the DMA. So I'll move to e-commerce platforms like Amazon and Booking, where the DMA prohibits most favored nation clauses, as we call them. This is when a hotel or a merchant charges 100 on Amazon or Booking, and Amazon or Booking says you may not sell for less than 100 on any rival platform. That, as a contractual matter, is not allowed, but the problem is that there's a way to replicate that, not with a contract, but with behavior. So if Booking sees the hotel for less somewhere else, they put the hotel on page 5, or Amazon takes the merchant out of the buy box, and then effectively you're not selling on Amazon. So the DMA doesn't allow that, and that should free up price competition quite considerably and allow for more competition between different e-commerce platforms and lower prices in Europe. Another nice thing that the DMA does is, well, there's the antitrust case in Europe, which bans some of the payments, the contractual arrangements that require OEMs to accept a bundle of Google Search as well as Google's operating system and Google Play. So when you combine that with the requirements of a neutral choice screen and the requirements of not self-preferencing, the idea is that we'll get a little bit more space and opening up in search. I think what the book describes is that's probably not enough, and that what we need is a bit more teeth. We don't have that in the United States either. The court remedy in the Google search case in the United States was, I think, largely ineffective. What you'd really want is to forbid Google payments for exclusives, and indeed forbid Google payments for defaults up to at most, let's say, half of the users of a particular channel. So Apple could, for example, pay Google for half the users on Apple, but not the other half. And the advantage to that would mean that Apple gets some money. They're being funded. I mean, we're not really worried about Apple, but think about Mozilla or some other channel partner getting some funding. But the lack of the other half of customers bringing in any money, in the case of Apple, that's $10 billion a year, you might look around and think, is there somebody else who might be willing to pay for the search traffic of these half of consumers? So that's an idea. Sharing the web index, Google's web index every day with rivals is another idea. And I think this forms a package of policies that could help us get more competition in search. I will say the problem with all of those policies is that at the end of the day, the OEM is 100% dependent on Google for its operating system. There is no other operating system that's an option for an OEM. Apple doesn't license theirs, so that leaves them with Google Android, and that's it. And the open source Google Android doesn't work because app developers write for Google Android, which has APIs that are in Google Play and are not in open source Android. So those apps just don't work on, say, the Amazon Fire. That's why the Amazon Fire didn't take off. So if you're really going to free a developer and the OEMs from the need to only use the Google operating system and therefore do what Google wants, I mean, you can contractually allow an OEM to install another search engine. It's then an open question whether the OEM really wants to install the other search engine if they know that will make Google upset, and Google is the existential supplier of the operating system that allows them to exist. So probably they're not going to do that. So I think what you really need to do is take the Google operating system, Android, branded Android, not open source Android, and shift that into a foundation, a nonprofit foundation that runs it, sells it, makes sure there's a tight version everybody can use, but which has a mission to expand output and not create market power and encourage R&D. And that thing would be open source. So there'd be a branded Android that everybody could count on working as a system. But if Samsung wanted to take that branded Android and go fork it and make something else, they could. So I think that's really the long run answer to freeing most device makers from the market power of the Android OS. Let me come back then to the social networks. I think the solution to the market power of Instagram and Facebook and TikTok is to turn them into something more like email. Right now, we communicate on these social networks, but they are controlled by one natural person or a foreign government. And that's a bit bizarre when you think about the postal service, the phone system, email, all of which are open or neutral or government controlled. So if you thought about turning social networks into something that looked a bit more like email, it would involve an open interface such that any ISP, so to speak, could come in and hook up to the personal social network. So I could run an ISP that was like a Facebook ISP that was, let's call it pro-social, so that it got rid of hate speech and left you feeling happy. And you would have an account with pro-social, and pro-social would be like other ISPs, just attached to the network and could send and receive any traffic from any of your friends that it wanted to, and its job would be to filter that traffic. The way an ISP filters spam, this curation entity attached to the social network would filter out hate speech or whatever it was that you wanted it to do. And then we'd have competition between these curation entities for attracting consumers and giving them the experience they wanted, while getting away from the market power of the network effects, because everybody would be on the same network and there would no longer be the market power of, and that an entrant just literally can't get over, because when they enter, they have no customers, so nobody wants to be connected to nobody. They all want to be on the network where their friends are. And so we have really major amounts of market power in these markets. So that's a quick tour through the ideas in the book, and I didn't give you kind of the heavy lifting of what literature do we have and how might we think about economic models that apply. That's sprinkled in there in an accessible way. But instead, I focused on the more creative side of the problem, which is, I think, difficult to foresee. When we think about regulation in the United States, we think about electricity. The government's going to set a price and tell you what technology to use and tell you how to invest. And in tech, you don't really want to be doing that. You want to do something much more subtle, like set an interface and give people rights to access the interface. And then you want to let 1,000 flowers bloom and have innovation on that interface. And that, I think, gets you somewhat the best of both worlds, erodes the market power, but allows for innovation and allows business users and other entities to really grow on top of the existing entrenched platforms that we have. The last chapter of the book talks about industrial policy, and I know Filippo wants to cover that in his questions, but basically there's three pillars of competition policy. One is competition enforcement, our usual antitrust, mergers, cartels kind of stuff. Then there's industrial policy, which fixes markets that are broken. So the market doesn't exist at all because of carbon externalities, or there's an externality from R&D that's positive, and the result of that is that individual private actors do too little R&D, that kind of problem. And then there's regulation where, like here, we've got monopolies, we can't do anything about it for whatever reason, and so we need to regulate them. And the point of this dichotomy to trichotomy, to divide the markets in three, is to show you that these are different tools for different problems. You don't have to sacrifice competition policy to do industrial policy, competition enforcement, sorry, to do industrial policy. Competition enforcement's for a merger in a market that's pretty effective. Industrial policy is for markets that are broken. So it's not difficult to fit these together and see how they affect and can improve all markets. And then you've got as many markets as possible working as hard as possible to benefit the consumer. And I think that's really the orientation I'd like to focus people on. All right, so that was all I wanted to say to open, and now I'm happy to discuss.
Awesome. No, this is an excellent overview, I think, of the book and the complexity that you have in this area, right? How quickly you get like to very important details that shape outcomes. But I think before we get into the details, I wanted to ask you first about the bigger picture and think about what we're trying to do with this project, also because we have students that they're joining. So your title is about making markets that work for people. And this kind of implies what you see as kind of like the end goal of all this like regulation enforcement and like the initiatives here. But at the same time, when you're talking a lot about, like increasing contestability, making sure that companies have fairness and things like fair fees and things like that. So who are the people for you? Like what is the end goal that we need to accomplish if this is to be a successful endeavor in the EU, in the US? Do you think they're the same actually in different countries that you're being in different jurisdictions to be engaged in? So how do you think about that?
Yeah, let me back up for a minute and say that I think one of the problems that economists have today, at least in the United States, is convincing the public, people watching this podcast, journalists, that actually they're interested in people. If I said to economists, I want to make markets work, the for people would be completely implied. Everyone would understand it was there. Everyone would know it was there. Everyone would understand that that was the reason that you wanted the market to work. You don't have to say it. But I think today in modern America, you have to say it. I don't just want markets to work because I'm some efficient market person. I want markets to work because when they do, they serve more humans with products that those humans want and enjoy and can afford. And that is why we have a capitalist economy. If we wanted to just have a command economy, we could make lots of steel and not really care whether the food tastes delicious or not. And people would have the kind of lives we saw in the Soviet Union or other kinds of bad outcome situations. And we don't want that. We want to unleash the creativity and the incentives of all the people who can run businesses to deliver people the stuff they want.
And just to dig a bit further, because I think that's very interesting. So you see this as mostly kind of like these policies are agnostic on the final outcome, as long as competition is working and the intermediaries are rivaling and challenging each other. Ultimately, this type of policies will not be in the business of trying to direct markets, trying to like some level of social planning that says, ultimately we want to have a green transition, we want to have something like this will be outside of the scope of these policies. So how do you think about this interaction?
Well, that's a little bit why there's the last chapter about industrial policy, because there are lots and lots of externalities that we worry about also as economists. So for one thing, there's safety of products that we cannot see as users. In the United States, we regulate car safety, we regulate safety of drugs, we regulate safety of toys, we regulate safety of food. This is completely normal. And we need to regulate the safety of digital platforms. So one of the papers in the book is about the safety of social media and how we are not doing that. And as a consequence, it's delivering mental health harms and anger to the population, and that's not safe. And that what we need to be doing is requiring the platforms to adhere to standards just the way we make automakers and pharmaceutical makers adhere to standards. So that's one big piece that that really matters to being able to say, having established a safety standard, I'm not going to tell you what color the car should be or what its sound system looks like or whether the seats are going to be leather or plastic. That's not part of the safety standard. That's part of what the market and competition deliver to people, and they enjoy having 7 seats versus 2. So that's a super, super important precondition. Then there's other kinds of externalities like carbon. If we don't price the carbon, and then everybody pollutes, and then the seawater rises, and Miami and New York and various other places are underwater, that's not something that as a society we want as a whole, but somehow we got there because we didn't price the input properly. So that's a place where industrial policy can come in and say, okay, we're going to have a carbon price, or we're going to have a certain subsidy for solar panels, or we're going to do whatever it is. And that's going to help us get to a market outcome that we like better than the one that is absent the government action.
Okay, and then just building on that and connecting, I think, with industrial policy. So do you see the DMA as being kind of orthogonal to industrial policy or as part of industrial policy? I write even thinking more. So Fiona has an excellent an older paper, not that old, I guess 3-4 years old, about like basically talking about markets for addiction, and these are bad markets, right? And how it's hard to assess welfare and antitrust enforcement into when products are addictive. And I was actually talking to a student yesterday and telling you should read Fiona's paper on that topic. So how do you see the DMA into this broader discussion, right? Because Americans are threatened now. If you go to the Hill, just 3 blocks down from here, everybody here thinks that the DMA is industrial policy and it's basically the EU protecting its own players. And how do you see that? Is this solely true, partially true? How is this engagement under your lenses?
If you think about the 3 pillars of competition policy that I just described, the enforcement, industrial policy, and regulation, the DMA is regulation. It's not industrial policy. So the DMA is saying we've got these monopolists, they're entrenched, there's nothing we can do about it. So what we're going to do instead is regulate them and require them to be non-discriminatory and have open interfaces that everybody can connect to, so that all the headphones and all the music apps and all the wallets and all the app stores can get in and serve people, despite the fact that there's a monopolist over any individual set of eyeballs, which is either Google or Apple. So it's really, that's what it is. It's monopoly regulation. In terms of industrial policy, that would be something like, let's put the port here and have the railway go to the port, and let's have a subsidy for batteries, and let's, that kind of, or maybe a tariff to protect our cars from foreign cars, something like that.
Okay, so you see a very clear separation between both processes, and basically like
Definitely.
I guess kind of like the processes and the end goals. Is this how you would think about them or no? Like what separates them? If you had to establish like a line, what's it's a
What
continuous
separates
line,
them?
of course.
Yeah, the kind of regulation I'm talking about in the competition space. So these are the 3 pillars of competition policy. There's all kinds of regulation like food. Okay, that's different. So in competition policy, the regulation is of the monopolist, an existing monopolist. Industrial policy is, how do I make some broken markets work better? Why are the markets broken? Because workers don't invest in the right skills because they don't understand what they are. Firms don't do enough R&D because they can't appropriate the returns from R&D. People burn too much coal because they don't understand that, or it's not priced, the harm that they're doing to the environment. So those are problems with markets that either don't exist at all or exist, but they're doing it wrong because there's a big externality. That's where you want the industrial policy. And pro-competitive industrial policy not only fixes the externality, but creates more competition than was there before. So let's think about the example I like to give of pro-competitive industrial policy is an electric vehicle charging station that is designed for that has the slots and the machines, and it's got the wiring coming in, so that wiring voltage setup is zoned to be legal across the whole EU. The shape of the plug is open and every car can plug in, and you can buy adapters or whatever. The APIs on the charging points are open to all the manufacturers who are legal to sell in Europe. and probably they have to pay some kind of cost per vehicle because you got to keep these charging stations working and so on. But that allows any manufacturer of an electric vehicle to join an existing network that's across the EU. It allows an engineering company to bid to build thousands of these things. It stops local zoning from saying, oh, you can't have one near me because it's too much voltage, or there might be a school a half a mile away or something like that. And then you get economies of scale, and you get widespread adoption of electric vehicles, because I think the elasticity of a consumer to knowing their vehicle can be charged really easily anywhere they go is pretty high. Right, that's a not thinking that you can have easy charging is a big reason why people don't buy an electric car.
Yeah, interesting. So how interoperability kind of merges both policies all at once, right, and brings them all
So
together.
you can do green, competition, interoperability, and it's all one big, marvelous policy that helps everybody.
Interesting. Yeah.
The plan.
And so we're already starting to get a lot of interesting questions. But before I dig deeper into the questions, I wanted to ask you something connected to that. So we started by saying how like you've been at the forefront of these debates for many years now, and I think these debates have benefited from you being at the forefront of them. So how do you like? We are now in this multi-year transition, right? I mean, the Stigler report came out in 2019 and was kind of advocating for something that the DMA became afterwards, and other like Brazil just proposed a DMA style rule. We have all this developing. The US is a different regime. The laws never really passed here. So how do you see as the successes and failures of this arch, like before we get deep into this? So reflect a little bit on us over the past like 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and how do you see where we are right now, where we were 8 years ago, where we are right now? What have you accomplished, and where are we failing?
Well, that's a really lovely softball question, Filippo, because it is true that I first got interested in this because Luigi Zingales asked me to chair that committee. And what that report does is it goes through how you would bring antitrust cases against the kinds of antitrust regime you'd need to successfully bring antitrust cases against digital platforms. After that, I went and wrote the theories of harm for all the platforms I could figure out how to do that for. So that was Amazon, Google Search, Google Ad Tech, and Facebook. And then thought, this is really taking a long time, and I'm not sure we're going to get to the end and have a remedy that does something that really works. And around the time that I was having doubts, the DMA was proposed. And I started studying that. And what we have seen happen is that antitrust enforcement in the United States is really not working. It's very slow. We've had one, it's true, the government won on liability in Google search, but the remedy is ineffective. So we're going to have a monopolist in search for the foreseeable future. I don't know if the government can win the case against Meta, the case against Apple. I hope they can win the case against Amazon. The case against Amazon, the remedy is rather simple. Just stop doing this external benchmarking. But the fact that you've got a single judge trying to do a remedy without a sectoral agency helping them, without any staff, and the digital platform they're dealing with makes hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and it has a raft of lawyers and a raft of communications specialists and a raft of lobbyists. It's just not, I think, plausible to imagine that a single judge is going to prevail and get stuff that consumers want in that environment. I think you need regulation. And the EU's approach, I think, is promising. They have designated 7 or 8 platforms, and they got 22 rules, and they're churning through doing them. Now, has there been a revolutionary change? No. But let's remember that in Europe, they still do rule of law and due process. And what that means is that every platform gets to challenge what's going on, and it's quick by the standards of law enforcement. But the first few cases just mean we're not going to get speed until the platforms being regulated understand what the court is willing to support and not. And it's not bothered. There's no point in challenging the agency because they already know what the answer is.
And
So I think we'll get there in a fairly short order. And just let me say one more thing. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the DMA. I'm a little worried about the UK's DMCCA because in principle that one was better because it allowed for bespoke regulation. That means regulation tailored to each platform. But now the government has intervened and given the CMA a strategic steer to not do very much regulation. And so the advantage of being flexible is a disadvantage when the government decides it doesn't want as much regulation, and in some ways, so I'm getting a little bit worried about that situation.
yeah, I wanted to build on these distinctions because I think it's interesting, and then I'll go to the questions. But like explain me a bit better why you're so confident that the DMA will deliver, right? So if you look at across the board, I mean, I've been in a couple of workshops recently. People were very delusional with the DMA. You know, they're like, this thing doesn't work. The commission has 50 people, and I agree with you that like maybe 50 people is much better than the judge, you know, because we had a hearing last week here where the judge was talking about remedies, and he was basically saying, "I'm done with this case. I don't want to see this case ever again." And people are like, "No, no, no! You impose behavioral remedies. You're gonna be here for many years now, and you better be prepared because we're gonna need you to come back." You know, and he kind of seemed surprised that now he is still gonna have to do supervising for the next
He
10,
needs to
6
read
years.
about Judge Green in AT&T.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like, oh, we impose a 6-year mandate. Guess who oversees is you, you know. But anyway, but the commission is like 50 people, right? 60, 80
Yeah.
people. So
So
the
let me
platforms
just
haven't done
say,
that much yet.
Filippo, okay, here's the thing. Economists are really, really good at criticizing. Everybody's really, really good at criticizing. So my challenge to the people listening is, if you want to complain about the DMA or any regulation, pick one. I'm going to give you two options. One, you prefer the status quo. You would like the monopolist to stay and be free to do anything they want. Or you have a better idea. Okay. So I am not saying the DMA is perfect. Nothing's going to ever be perfect. Of course, I have a long list of complaints about the DMA, and if you read the book, you'll find them. But what I'm saying is, looking around the world based on what I know, so far the DMA has actually delivered some rules about accessories. There are a couple of app stores that have entered. The situation is not good. They need to get the technological part of this fixed up so that both Apple and Google allow those app stores to function properly. But they're coming in. We have multiple digital wallets. It's possible for advertisers and publishers to have better tools to see how their advertising dollars being spent. You can port your data in real time out of a digital platform and give it to somebody else. There are real things that you can do. And that's just not true anywhere pretty well else, except because of Epic in the United States. On Apple, an app can now tell its users, a developer can tell its consumers, you can buy my stuff cheaper outside. Okay, that doesn't mean it gets a third-party app store. It just means it can tell you, go to the web and buy it for less. And we'll see whether Epic v. Google gives us third-party app stores on Android, which I'm cautiously optimistic about also.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think one thing that I think these are important questions and important comments to reflect about how to improve it. From my side, for me, the main thing that the DMA has delivered actually, which I think people underestimate, including myself sometimes, is that we change the conversation, right? It's like we're no longer talking about liability for 6 years. Like where we are in Google search now, that we're going to spend like 6 years discussing implementation. At least now all the action is in implementation, and in many areas it hasn't delivered at all. But at least now the talk is like, how can it deliver on these priorities versus like, is there any liability here? But that's a thing that for me, this is if you look back into the Google search case, the decision by the commission, like the decision is like 200 and something pages long, and the remedies part's like 3 pages, you know, and that's kind of like a pattern. But now all the actions in these 3 pages, and you can throw out the other 200 and so many pages. That's the thing that's the nice part. But let's get to the questions. There's a lot of questions already. People are very engaged. So
Okay, good.
Tracy Shu asks a question. How do we think about balancing and promoting innovation versus preventing entrenchment here? So especially when scale and data accumulation both drive and consumer welfare and market power, how do you see this like meaningful, like, would you believe that the DMA will lead to meaningful improvements to grow innovation and development of new products? Like, how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of my favorite aspects of the DMA is the fact that the open interface encourages innovation. I think it's really unrealistic to imagine that a business user will spend real money on innovation, that when it has to deliver that innovation through a platform that belongs to a big digital platform that can cut them off at any time. So if you don't really have real access to your end users, if you don't have control about talking to and selling to your end users, it's not very sensible to invest in a business on that platform. So I think one of the really great things about the DMA is that it's a very pro-innovation statute. Now, are those business users going to be at scale? They're not replacing the platform. They're operating on the platform. So it's not really about getting an entrant who can come up to scale and be like Amazon or be like Facebook or be like Google search. Now, having said that, those businesses on top of the platform can grow and morph into competition with the platform. And that is exactly why the platform likes to cut them off. So in a world with the DMA with legal certainty where they can't be cut off, you can imagine them growing and morphing. So I'll give the example I often give, which is my kids are very addicted to Spotify. They are on there all the time and they have playlists and they share their playlists with their friends. I am sure that Spotify knows very well who their friends are and the intensity of those social links. If Spotify added some text and some images and I don't know, some other functionality, Spotify might have a social network really rapidly. Now, that puts them into a different category. And would a digital platform like it that they were moving into a social network? Would that digital platform want to shut that down or modify it or change the functionality? It doesn't matter now because that platform is regulated and cannot discriminate against a business user who has a good idea.
And so do you see innovation as almost like a positive byproduct of fairness and contestability done right? Or do you see innovation kind of like a pillar of its own under the DMA and its obligations?
I think it's part of what you get when you have competition. When you have competition and outside options, and I can take my good idea to one of three places to get users, then I get returns from my idea. Then I want to have an idea because I can get returns from it. I want to invest and build it. So the competition gets you innovation, and the competition comes from not having all your rents expropriated because there's only one monopoly way to get to your end users. There still is only one monopoly way to get to your end users, but the monopolist is constrained into how much it can extract.
Thank you. And keep sending questions. So we have two questions that are very connected, actually. I think we're a bit more connected to the beginning of the talk. So Nurul and Jerry push back on the assumption that the markets always work for the average or low income person versus for the economic elite person. So basically, how do you reconcile this kind of like presupposition that the competition will ultimately deliver for everyone in an environment where basically, like some powerful parties can benefit even more from this kind of what comes out of the outcome, I think, rather than like basically the average person really benefiting. Yeah. So do you think that the DMA will benefit the average European person versus like the elites who like the services more?
No, it's an excellent question. We have to keep in mind a couple of things. One, that innovation and firms respond to revenue and profits. So if there are richer people willing to pay higher prices for a good, that's a more attractive market than if that same number of people are poorer and willing to pay lower prices for a good. So markets are, in that sense, biased toward the more well-off. I think what I notice about the way that markets are not serving regular people is through this safety regulation aspect. I think that it is easier if you are well educated and well resourced to figure out what is addictive and not use it and pay for a substitute. Perhaps I'll have a subscription version of something rather than the ad-supported version of something. It's easier for well-off people to buy healthy vegetables and so on. So it is extremely important that we get the safety regulation aspect of digital markets right, and that includes choice architecture. So what do I mean by that? Let's imagine that we wanted to allow people to benefit from their personal data. And I have a whole section in the book about personal data and how right now, basically Meta and Google take it all and make billions of dollars from it. And users don't see the benefit of their personal data because they don't control it well enough. Now, if I can control my personal data and keep it away from the digital platform, then it doesn't make as much money off of me. Then it might say, well, I'm missing $10 a year that I would otherwise make off of Fiona. Why don't I offer her 5? And then she gets 5, I get 5, I make a market using targeted ads, and everybody's happy. That's fine as long as the way the digital platform asks me empowers me and doesn't exploit me. And that exploitation is often very correlated with socioeconomic status. So we need to make sure that choice architecture is set up such that people really are thoughtful and making choices that don't endanger them. So they're not going to sell religion and sex and political information. What we might want to let people sell is, I am looking for shoes and I want them to be sandals and red and I live in New York. That might be the sort of information that I'm actually quite happy to sell because I quite like to find those shoes, and then I'll get an ad, a targeted ad. So if we can set up markets for personal data in a way that benefit users and aren't exploitative, that creates ad revenue that supports content that lower income people can have for free by sharing data in a way that's safe for them, that they have
And do you
chosen.
see the DMA doing that, effectively doing that, or
The
it's
DMA is not doing
totally
that.
outside
The
of
DMA is not doing that. It's now what the DMA is doing is really allowing the commission to enforce some of the privacy rules in the GDPR. So platforms cannot combine sources of data without the person's permission, and if they're going to harvest process personal data, they have to ask in a way that gets informed consent that's proper. I mean, in the sense that I just described it. So it may be that if the commission successfully enforces the DMA, we will see these markets for data being put forward by Meta and Google. The DMA doesn't explicitly mandate them.
Yeah, so let me just ask another question here, that then we'll go to another topic. It's like the other day I was reading a statistics talk about the US. So I don't remember exactly, but it was something like 70% of consumption in the US right now is done by the top 20% of households or something like that. It's kind of like this ballpark, though the numbers might be. So in what circumstances is the type of competition in digital markets are expanding, shaping, like, why do we expect that competition here would deliver for the other 80% that are outside of the 70% group of top consumers, right? So is this totally outside of the regulation, or is this something that basically we need to
I
do
think
remove that clause?
it's what markets are good at. Let's suppose that a lot of those people have handsets. Would they like to have a handset that has an app store for children that is really a locked down set of content that's not going to harm their child, and they can let the child consume out of the children's app store? Would they like to consume news that's from newspapers and not have to scroll around X or TikTok to get their news, and be able to do that in a way that's ad supported because they can share their data and go to a newspaper store and find newspapers that are willing to subscribe, have the package that they want? I mean, it's a bit like, just look out the window. I mean, there are restaurants, there are cars, there are towels, I mean, the economy has goods for everybody. And we want digital markets to have that too. But right now, when you've got a monopolist in so many sectors, you're getting the monopoly outcome: monopoly prices, monopoly quality, monopoly levels of innovation. It's not surprising that people are not happy with that.
Interesting. So Charles has a question about AI, right? So he says, do you believe that if AI systems then do end up disrupting Google's dominance in search, would that show that you have at some point entrenched platform monopolies that are disruptable? Sorry, my Portuguese, disruptable at some level, and how do we prevent the entrenchment on the next market, given that AI is kind of outside of the DMA's purview, at least direct DMA's purview?
Let's do the US and then the EU. So on the US side, if AI disrupts Google, then hooray, we have all just won the lottery, because certainly the remedy in the search case is not going to do that. So that's one option. Let me just point out there's option B, which is Google runs its playbook again, just the way it did with search, on AI, and we end up with an AI monopoly in the United States. So that's option B. On the European side, the DMA doesn't regulate AI per se, but it's difficult to think really that AI is a core platform service. It's easier to think about AI as being in existing core platform services. So if AI becomes part of search, search is already covered under the DMA. If AI becomes a part of video sharing is already covered under the DMA. So I think in a basic sense, the DMA does include AI. It's just doing it through the products that we consume already, like video, social networks, search, etc.
Interesting. And so part of what I think is happening as a reaction to the DMA is companies delaying the release of innovation or like new products, let's put like this, in Europe on the argument that the DMA somehow blocks them. Like I think the AI overviews were at some point delayed. When Meta launched Threads, they said, we're not launching Threads in Europe because of the DMA. The DMA prevents us. Do you see this as kind of like, yeah, that's it, that's exactly what the DMA should be doing? Like, or do you see this basically as kind of like negative byproduct of the regulation and companies trying to argue beyond what the
Yeah,
regulatory requires?
I think it's more the former, with companies trying to use it as a PR stunt. I mean, it's a bit like saying, I've beta tested my medicine and I'm going to try it out on the sick people in America. And, the Europeans won't let it in yet because I haven't proven that it works. And I'm going to call that lack of innovation in Europe, when in fact, it's harvesting people's personal data in a new way that's new without asking them permission, or doing something that excludes rivals, and that exclusionary conduct is built into the new algorithm, and so it's not legal in Europe. I mean, I tend to think that a few weeks of delay to get a product that's either safer or doesn't exclude rivals is worth it. I mean, I don't know. Does anyone really miss Threads for a few weeks?
It's interesting. Actually, for the Threads case, was actually the DMA doing its job, because basically what they had to reframe was like they were using the Instagram logging system to have threads. And so this is kind of like a potential leveraging of a large company entering, I guess, smaller company, Twitter. And so I was like, no, that's actually true. Yeah, the DMA is blocking and they're doing the right thing. They actually did their homework. Versus the other way around, So that's why I think that this conversation is interesting, like to this level of delay, and at some point had to build a separate infrastructure for separate thread signing. So you don't see this kind of like that's part of the game, and that's basically what's going to happen or not, or so.
Yeah, I so far I have not seen an example that seems to me to be a safe, great innovation that has been delayed in Europe, and therefore Europeans are harmed. It seemed more like the innovations weren't quite ready for prime time, or they were not compliant with the laws in Europe. And so then it's 450 million pretty well off people. I mean, you're going to you make your automobile to pass the safety standards in Europe, you're going to make your digital platform pass the safety standards in Europe.
Interesting. So there's a flip question from Gulsa, who asks, so do you think that there's this shift from his calling neoliberal competition laws in regards to the DMA to the MCCA? But why don't you see here kind of like the opposite, which is the Brussels effect, right? For a very long time, the Brussels effect was a talk of town as a basically, Europe is imposing stricter standards, platforms are rolling them out around the world. I think it's very clear that this is not happening in digital markets anymore. The AI, the DMA is definitely not being. Apple's definitely. I actually lived in Switzerland for 3 years, and you couldn't download the Epic Store in Switzerland. It's kind of like border by every single EU country you can imagine. So they're like, no, not here. We're gonna do as much ring fencing as we geo-blocking as we can. So how do you see this like discussion about the Brussels effect and the externalization of these European laws to other countries?
Filippo, I wouldn't count your chickens before they hatch in the following sense. There are jurisdictions like South Korea, Japan, Brazil, Australia that are trying to figure out what they want to do. And a lot of those jurisdictions, I think, would like to follow the EU because that's a regulation that's already adopted by a very large bloc. So if you're a small country, you can kind of join, and then the digital platform can't complain too much because they don't have to do something different. And remember that we have the Epic cases in the United States. So let's imagine in a year, Google has to have third-party app stores in the United States. They already today have to have third-party app stores in Europe. So now Google's got third-party app stores mandated in 2 big jurisdictions. Are they really going to run another model of Android that doesn't allow third-party app stores in India and Brazil and other places? I mean, those countries, if they did that, those countries might say, well, wait, we want the same thing that everybody else has. Now we're going to pass a law. So I don't really think it makes sense for them to be running lots of different versions of these platforms around the world. And I think it requires the DMA to be successful. I think Europe has to show there's innovation coming out of this and stuff that people want is coming out of it. And once people want it, then the whole thing's over.
And so Bruno Renzetti is joining us, and Bruno works for CADE, so I can ask his question in 2 ways. So one is like Brazil just proposed a version of digital regulation. So would you say like it's a bit more aligned with the British system than exactly the DMA, but it's kind of going this direction. So your advice would be for even like developing countries go full steam ahead. And then connected, I think more connected to Bruno's question is like the Draghi report shook everything in Europe in the conversation about competitiveness and innovation and regulation. And you were part of the Draghi report as well. So how do you see the conclusions coming out of the Draghi report impacting exactly this discussion? Like the Draghi report is being used by companies to kind of push for lax merger enforcement, for example. We saw this basically this week with pushback from antitrust authorities.
Yeah.
Tell us, how do you see the impact of the Draghi report into the DMA and digital regulation more broadly? Like how does this come through?
I think they're very synergistic. It's interesting to me that even somebody like you, I mean, in your prep question, you said, oh, the Draghi report said we have to water down.
No, I said people said they said that. I didn't say it.
And it's incorrect. Exactly. If you go and read the chapter on competition enforcement, it doesn't say that. But people that would like less competition enforcement assert that the Draghi report says there should be less competition enforcement, and that is not right. And I think what the Draghi report does is, and not coincidentally, because I did have some input on it, it does have this distinction between the competition enforcement, the industrial policy, and the regulation. So again, the DMA is about getting competition on the platform through regulation. The industrial policy stuff is largely not the focus of the competition chapter, but you can easily work in industrial policy to appropriate competition enforcement if you want. You can say, for example, these 2 pharmaceutical firms, when they merge, will be changing 2 supply chains into 1 supply chain. That creates risk. That's not as resilient. That's harmful to consumers. We don't want to have that merger because when we get the next shock, we'll be short of an essential medicine. So that's a very normal way to think about a merger. What's the harm to consumers? And it just builds in our new understanding of the world, which is we have wars and pandemics and stuff that's really disruptive. So I don't see that there's a conflict between any of these things. Once you decide that you want all your markets to work properly and that you don't want to take public money and set it on fire by giving it to a well-connected firm and hoping they do something good, okay, which is just never going to work. If you don't do that, if you say, I'm going to zone for an electric vehicle charging station, or I'm going to put in some subsidies for clean technology that are available to anybody who satisfies the criteria of delivering the clean technology, you should be fine. And nothing conflicts. None of this conflicts. It's all about making markets work for the people at the end of the day.
I'll ask a final question before I go because it was fascinating. So one of the things that you touch is the role of private enforcement, right? Like you talk about the Epic case in the US, a private enforcement case. You've been working as an expert in the UK, where I think has the most interesting private enforcement jurisdiction in the world right now in digital markets, actually the UK and the class actions there. So how do you see the role of private plaintiffs in these systems, right? The DMA has very little private enforcement, though people are being creative. The UK has now a lot of private enforcement and people are trying to push back. So how do you see, like, being someone who's also like making the dough, like how do you see private plaintiffs here and the role that they play into this ecosystem that is not designed for them?
I mean, let's remember that the DMA does have private enforcement. You can be a business user, and if you're not being let into the platform in the way that the law says, you can bring a case in your national court. So that is definitely a possibility. I think it's exciting because historically, when we thought the government was doing a good job, we didn't really put a lot of weight on the private enforcement because they did a bit of ambulance chasing, less meritorious cases, because kind of the idea was that the good cases the public sector is taking. But in a world where the public sector won't take those cases because they're not interested in helping people, or they're protecting the monopolist, or they're afraid of some geopolitical blowback, so the government doesn't want to take the step of bringing the case, then private parties can bring those cases, and that is a really powerful channel because while private litigation is harder, when the private plaintiff is correct, then I think there's a good chance that you get an outcome that's helpful.
Okay, can I just ask a
Let's
final
hope for
question?
that.
So most of the litigation happening, at least a lot in the UK, is like class action lawsuits, right? You're seeing less litigation by like Spotify, like Epic Games, like you see in the US, is not bringing these claims in Europe, at least not as far as I know. So why do you think is that? Like, and is there a disconnect between the class action plaintiffs and the corporate plaintiffs?
Yeah, the thing you have to remember is 2 times duopoly profit is less than monopoly profit. So if I'm the excluded party and I sue, the thing the platform's going to do is just pay me because it's always worthwhile to pay the duopolist to go away compared to litigating and having to share the market, and then you got duopoly profit, and that's much less than monopoly profit. So you don't tend to see private Section 2, 102 kind of cases moving forward to litigation because it is always in the interest of the monopolist to pay off the challenger. Why did Epic prevail or continue and then prevail? Because they're not interested in money. The head of Epic wants to open an app store. So that's what we would call injunctive relief, not money. And when you want injunctive relief, well, then yes, you could get litigation to the end because the monopolist doesn't want to let you in.
Interesting. And in the US, a lot of these indirect lawsuits are barred. But there's so much for the conversation. Fiona, thank you very much for the time, for the chat. It was very enlightening for everyone. I also learned a lot, and it's a pleasure.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and please, everybody, read the book. Go to my website, download it, share it with your friends. I think it's pretty fun.
Yeah, exactly. I recommend that for sure. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and then we
Bye-bye.
conclude
Thank you.
here. Ciao, ciao.